For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. I've known my guest, Erik Brynjolfsson, since early in my career, and it's been a pleasure over the years staying up to date on his research and his thinking, which today focuses on data-driven decisions, how AI works in business, and the intangible or digital assets of companies. I'm particularly drawn to the distinctions that Erik makes between augmentation and automation in his work on AI. His insights offer guidance to all CX professionals and other business leaders thinking about how to augment their work with machine learning and automation without automating themselves out of a job. Erik's work is impressive. He's a professor at Stanford, as well as a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, the director of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, the Ralph Landau Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Now, in addition to all that, he's also a co-founder of WorkHelix, a company that provides a data-driven compensation platform for the rapidly changing world of work. He's naturally a best-selling author, and he does speak all around the world. I think we had a great conversation. A few areas I think you'll particularly enjoy. Our discussion of how, as business leaders, we need to push ourselves in our thinking about the power conferred by data-driven strategy, the importance of being creative, and how machine learning and AI can augment our human decisions rather than just replicate existing processes. Finally, how early adopters stand to gain from the ongoing explosion in the volume of data available for business. Fundamentally, I hope you'll be cheered by his insistence there's no shortage of engaging work for humans, even as AI becomes more powerful. There's still hope for us yet. Erik, thanks very much for joining us live from the Stanford University campus, which I know is where your home is.
That's right. It's a pleasure to see you, Richard.
As always, we could probably have a bigger conversation about moving from MIT to Stanford. I mean, smarter people would focus on the alternative academic viewpoints. Obviously, I would simply dwell on the fact that it's got to be a heck of a lot warmer, and you don't have February.
I do love the weather. This morning, I was just having my coffee sitting outside, looking. There's this Stanford Dish Trail, a couple thousand acres behind my backyard, and I feel very blessed to be here. I love the people back in Massachusetts and MIT, but there's amazing people here, and you just can't beat the weather.
Yeah, well, if you're forced in your career to sort of choose between MIT and Stanford, then you're getting something right. These aren't exactly. Either choice seems pretty good. Looking at your work over the years, and you and I first connected a long time ago when e-commerce was fashionable or was a breakthrough topic. But a lot of the work you've done, perhaps more recently, has been really focused around this topic, which I think is so interesting and important, around data-driven decision-making, right? And
right.
Which is a term that's bandied around a great deal, right? A lot of companies would say, we want to become much more data-driven. But first of all, before we sort of talk about your definition of that, why pick up that particular area to focus on?
Well, for a long time, I've been very interested in how digital technologies were changing the world. It's what I focused on for my PhD dissertation, working with Tom Malone and others at MIT. And in my classes, my MBA classes, I show the students how you can use data to make better decisions. And so I wanted to measure it more carefully to see if it was actually having an effect on performance and productivity. And I mean, you got to kind of walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
What's the impediment to this, right? It seems so intuitively obvious, and most people would say, all right, it's a better idea to be more data-driven, but clearly we're somewhere on a continuous curve here between embryonic and fairly proficient, I assume, for some companies. What's the barrier to adopting these approaches?
Well, there's really two big barriers. The first one was just the availability of data. I mean, we literally couldn't measure things the way we can now. I sometimes compare it to the advent of the microscope for biology, the ability to get very fine-grained data and see what's happening inside of organizations, with your customers, with your suppliers. digital data, we have literally millions of times more data than we used to have. Everything's become digitized. So that's a revolution in measurement. But the more fundamental revolution is in management and culture, that even if you have all this data, there's still an instinct. I mean, really hundreds of years of decision making to use your gut, use your instincts to make decisions. And it's a very different mindset. It's a cultural change that takes place. I'm sure your listeners have heard the concept of hippos, that the traditional way that organizations make decisions is with the highest paid person's opinion. And that worked tolerably well for a long time. And even companies that have a lot of the data, they continue to have that culture that way. So for me, the biggest barrier has been now almost every company has the data, but they still don't have the cultural change to say, hey, let's step back. Instead of going with your gut and driving ahead with what you think is the right answer, be humble and say, let's let the data speak, and have a hypothesis. And if the data supports it, great. If the data doesn't support it, be willing to go the other way. That's not a natural way for most leaders to make decisions.
Yeah, and I wonder if it varies a lot by functions and organizations. So, I traditionally used to think, okay, manufacturers understood data. I mean, if you were running a manufacturing plant, right, you had a good deal of understanding of data, because if you didn't understand to the nth degree what was going on the plant, you couldn't achieve productive output. Mm-hmm. And it's a very unforgiving environment if you don't have your arms around the numbers. And then marketers kind of embraced data probably with the start of marketing automation, so maybe 15 years or so ago, when we got this vast amount more marketing data. Mm-hmm. Salespeople always, to me, seem like the last bastion, right? Sales somehow still feels like this process that people think of as being extremely personal, judgmental, rather than a process that can be guided by data. So it feels like there's different levels of adoption across the enterprise today.
Yes. I think that's exactly right. And a lot of it comes with when the data became available. Like even within manufacturing, we've seen big differences. We've analyzed hundreds of thousands of firms, and the ones that have continuous flow operations where there's a lot of data, often in real time, they've become data driven much more quickly than the ones that work in batches. They don't have the frequency of data. But even there, we all know about the Six Sigma movement. And as you said, in marketing, there's a revolution there. A lot of my best students go into to marketing and advertising because there's such good data there, and it just allows you to exquisitely do a lot of, especially A/B tests. We should hopefully talk a little bit about the whole experimental cycle as well. And then you're right, sales, a lot of people think that there's a lot of EQ, emotional intelligence involved in sales, and there certainly is, but it's also something that if you do it right, you can use data to make better decisions.
Yeah, I think it might have, and I'm trying to remember exactly who said this. I think it might be one of your colleagues from MIT, Andrew Lowe, started talking about data as an asset on the balance sheet at companies, right? And the mentality that says companies need to think about data as an asset. And interestingly enough, you see the emergence of these chief data officers. And, right. And I was a little skeptical at first whether companies really understood what that meant. But I think a lot of these guys have quite impressive mandates and thought processes around building data as an asset within the company.
Yeah, I think we are in the early stages of a revolution in how economists think about the economy. It used to be capital and labor were the two big inputs, and even before that, land to some extent. And now we're seeing data on a par, or for many kinds of companies, more important. I mean, think about what are the most valuable companies on the planet, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, Facebook. They're all intensely digital companies. And for all of them, data is really the lifeblood of their success.
The argument against that often comes from companies that aren't technology companies intrinsically, right? And so they've always said, well, that's all well and good. We're always, folks like myself, we're always going around saying, well, the best examples are companies like this. They're either digital natives or tech companies. But ultimately, doesn't this only work when mainstream businesses, maybe 100-year-old companies, sort of change their management processes as well?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, it's easy for me, and I went to those go-to examples, but the reality is every company is becoming more and more digital, and every process is becoming more digital. There's the pure digital companies, and it's really easy to see there. But even like, you take retailers. I did a careful study of CVS a while back, and they were able to take the data from all their customers and then learn what works and what doesn't work and replicate it across lots of their different operations. And you saw a lot of the same kinds of patterns that you saw in the pure digital companies. And it's very hard for me to think of an industry that isn't becoming more and more data-driven. There's always a mix, but the data is often what separates the winners from the losers. I mean, to give you some quantitative evidence on this, we're doing a paper, just finishing up a paper about, we call it digital assets. And what we found was that every company has some degree of digital assets. These are the data and digital tools that complement their computer hardware and software. But it's very concentrated. If you take out those pure digital companies that I mentioned earlier, you look within industries, you look within manufacturing, finance, retailing, even there, it's a very skewed distribution. The top 10% of firms within each of those industries tends to use their digital data much more effectively than the other 90%. And so we're seeing I would have expected a convergence. We're actually seeing a separation where the digital companies are kind of pulling away. Sorry, let me be clear about that. The companies within each industry that are using digital assets effectively are pulling away from their competitors.
Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me as much, given that there's a sort of cumulative effect here. I mean, one of the advantages of being early to investing in digital asset development or data asset development is that you get a cumulative effect over time. If you're capturing the entire data exhaustion from your customers, then you build that data asset over multiple years. Somebody late to the party is always disadvantaged because they don't have this, historical depth of data to draw from. So it makes it very hard for them to make smarter decisions. And I'd add, let's face it, building data assets is a laborious and often challenging process that does take years to get right.
Yeah, and it must be what you're saying. I think there's some kind of a positive feedback, because in some areas of economics, you tend to get convergence, but in this area, we're seeing this divergence. So I think that the leaders, they just build on those advantages and pull further away.
One of the other
kind
things,
of a winner-take-all effect, in many cases.
Well, yeah. Which turns out so often, right? In so many different dimensions of business, the top 10% sort of take the house every time. And you see that in the stock market if you analyze stock market returns. Right. So it shouldn't surprise us perhaps much. One of the distinctions you've made, which I thought was fascinating, is this distinction between automation and augmentation. Mm-hmm. And it's particularly relevant when it comes to applications of AI, because we've sort of tuned, certainly the general public, to think, okay, driverless cars is the future. There's a bit of a running joke that when Ridley Scott made Blade Runner, what he said, the future 20 years from then was going to be, androids and driverless cars, flying cars. When they made the next version of Blade Runner, the future 20 years was going to be flying cars and androids. So we're always 20 years or so away from flying cars and androids. But perhaps you could explain the distinction between automation and augmentation to start.
Sure. I think it's always been iconic to imagine AI that replicates humans. There's the Turing test. Alan Turing said the definition of intelligence is if we could make a machine that is indistinguishable from humans. So that's a fun goal. And actually, I was reading the mythology. People have been thinking about this for literally thousands of years. However, from an economist perspective, it turns out to be a very inappropriate goal. One problem with it from a entrepreneur or CEO's perspective is that in a way, it's not ambitious enough. If you simply replicate humans, you're sort of setting a ceiling on what you could be doing. If you augment humans, you can do new things you never could have done before. So if you're doing, marketing or customer experience or manufacturing, you're able to make new experiences, new materials, new products and services that didn't exist. And that's where most of the value comes from. The other challenge is that if you replicate humans, you tend to devalue human labor, and it leads to more of a concentration of wealth and power, and you end up having a more unequal society. So that's something a lot of us don't want as much either. But in practice, it's rare that you can replicate the entire process from soup to nuts that humans are doing. Usually there's a part of it that machines can do really well, and there's another part that machines cannot do very well. And so having humans and machines work together, you're more likely to have a significant payoff.
You know, I remember when you and Andy McAfee created that first book, Race Against the Machine. I think the popular media interpretation at the time was robots are coming for your job, right? And I think you guys went to great lengths to, I think, emphasize the positive outlook for this. Because if I remember that at the time, there was a sort of natural tendency in the media to say, you know, doom and gloom, robotics automation essentially equals job elimination. And you had some data in that book that showed divergence of pay scales over time between highly educated and relatively uneducated people. And so you put two and two together and you say, look, relatively uneducated people are losing ground in the economy, and here come the robots. And it's not hard for people to draw a conclusion that things are going to get worse.
Well, and one of the things we tried to stress in that book, and I continue to try to stress, is that we have a choice. It's less about predicting what's going to happen and more about choosing which path we want. So we came up with this, I think, slightly clumsy phrase. We talked about racing against the machine, where it's like the machine replacing humans, versus racing with the machine, where you use the machine to help you do better and you're partnering with the machine. And it gets to what you were saying earlier about augmenting versus automating. In time and time again, we've seen that when you augment humans with the machine, you end up having better outcomes. I mean, let me tell you about one project I'm working on right now with a company called Cresta.ai, and they have a helping with call centers, augmenting people in call centers. They wisely chose not to try to have a bot answer all the questions that are coming in and have a AI answer the questions. We've all had bad experiences with that. Instead, they have the human answer the questions, but the AI gives them help, gives them hints. And there are many times the AI is watching hundreds of thousands of these conversations and sees which ones work better and which ones don't work as well. And it basically coaches the human, fills them in on some details about when you should upsell or when you should consider this other option. The reason that works so well is that we looked at the types of calls that come in, and it's this power law, Pareto curve. There are a few questions that come up over and over, and the machine can help a lot with those and have you answer them more efficiently and effectively. But then there's this long tail of really like weird questions that the machine has never seen before. And one of our strengths as humans is we can handle those exceptions better. So by combining the human and machine, you're able to cover the whole space of it, doing more efficiently the ones that the machine has seen before, but also handling the unusual cases. And that's what we see in lots and lots of places, not just call centers. I mean, I'll give you one more example. My friend Jeff Hinton, about 5 years ago, said that we should stop training radiologists because machines can recognize a lot of medical images better. Well, since he said that, we actually have more radiologists than we did back then. And we look more closely at it. It's the same thing that, yes, there's part of what they do that machines can do very well, identifying specific little things on medical images. But radiologists, according to our work, do about 26 distinct tasks. They counsel patients, they coordinate with other doctors, they sometimes administer sedation. And machine learning can only help with a piece of what they're doing. And this is what I think most of your listeners will find is that you want to use machine learning where it's appropriate, helping with parts of the jobs. But by keeping the human in the loop, you're much more likely to have a robust solution than trying to step back and automate the whole thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that in some ways the developed world has a productivity challenge, right? If we're going to keep pace with the developing world, which has relatively low-cost labor, our solution is to increase productivity in developed countries. Right? And, you know, we're not necessarily seeing population growth, we're seeing aging populations at the same time. So you put the two and two together, and it becomes an imperative to find ways, if we're going to keep the standard of living or ideally improve our standard of living, we have to improve human productivity across the board in these developed economies. So the idea of augmentation fits into that very elegantly. And frankly, if it's not going to be augmentation through data, what other tricks do we have up our sleeve? I mean, we've probably gone through the sort of manufacturing productivity curves at this point, supply chain productivity curves. This seems like the most promising approach now to create much more productive populations and, enable us to sort of keep our societies moving when we may only have, 2% population growth, but we want 5 or 6% GDP growth.
Right.
This is the missing
part. We're
going
to have to boost productivity. And I have to confess, I've been pretty disappointed by the productivity numbers. In the late 90s and early 2000s, productivity grew in the United States by about 2.4, 2.5% per year. Since then, it's only grown by about 1.3%, less than half as fast. So that's been pretty disappointing. And it's not just the United States. You look at Europe, Japan, just about all the OECD countries have had a slowdown. And to me, that was a puzzle because I think we have some eye-popping, amazing technologies rolling out. But when we look more closely, it gets to part of what you've been saying, that we're not making the organizational changes. We're not rethinking the business to take advantage of these technologies. If you simply paste the technology on top of what you're doing or try to swap out one person with one machine, that rarely leads to significant benefits. You need to step back and reconceptualize the process. That takes longer, and it requires more creativity by managers. But if you do that, that's where the bigger gains come from.
So where are the big opportunities for companies now to sort of augment human judgment with data?
Well, I think that it's something that there's a lot of small specific areas, but the basic template you're looking for is a place where there's a lot of digital data as inputs and a lot of digital data as outputs. So if you can measure things reasonably well, and we were talking earlier at the beginning of the discussion about how much more data is available, anytime you're kind of mapping a set of X's into a set of Y's and you've got digital data on both sides, there's an opportunity for machine learning to really change what you're doing. I think we're very far from AGI, the Terminator, or the androids that can kind of do everything. But we do have, I think, not just human level, but superhuman level ability to start mapping X's into Y's. The real trick is making sure you have the data. And most organizations, if they look around, they'll find that they have just a flood of digital data that can be organized and processed. One of the biggest barriers actually is just the data management issues of getting into a form where you can use it effectively, because in most cases, it wasn't collected for the purpose of running a machine learning system. It was collected for some other purpose, and now you have to reorganize it. And that's where the successes lie.
Yeah, and I think a lot of companies are very nervous about that problem. The most common thing I hear in conversation is always, "You won't believe how bad our data is." By the way, that's a universal statement. So everyone thinks they're terrible at it, but the reality is they're probably close to average. And it seems like it becomes almost paralyzing. Either we're going to wait for the silver bullet to arrive, which is some sort of grand unification of all our data assets in this beautiful data warehouse in the sky, where all of these things become immediately abundant and accessible, or we're just going to freeze. We can't deal with the reality where we are. And it seems like the general guidance, well, I would suggest, is you're going to have to start, and you're going to have to recognize this is going to take a while.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You want to start, and the data wasn't collected for this purpose, so you're going to have to be willing to kind of manage it and deal with the noise and the errors and have a robust enough system, and go through an iteration cycle where you learn from it. You start relatively small. And then iterate and learn from that. That's what, especially out here in Silicon Valley, you see that they're very willing to test, put a beta version out there, learn from it, and keep iteratively improving. It's a formula that eventually gets you to a lot of success.
You mentioned also one of your pieces, you pointed out that the typical stakeholders here, which I think you identified as technologists, the business executives and policymakers, all to some degree have incentives to push the idea of automation rather than augmentation. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, just to be clear, you can often get a lot of benefit from automation. You can get a lot of benefit from augmentation. It's not like one is always the right answer, but when I look at the data, we're overemphasizing automation and replacement and not putting enough emphasis on augmentation. And those three groups that you mentioned each have a problem with that. So the technologists, I'm hanging around with a lot of them. They have this iconic Turing test of trying to match what humans do, and it's kind of a little bit lazy, but common for AI researchers, whether they're in companies or the university, to say, hey, match what the human is doing, playing chess, or this hand picking up a coffee cup or whatever. They tell their students or their team just to do what the human is doing, but do it with a machine. It's an easy, well-specified task, but it's very much focused on automating rather than let's do something new. Likewise, I think managers also have the same mentality of looking at the existing process and thinking, what can we do to automate it? Like in my paper, the Turing Trap, where I flesh this out a little bit more, I give the example of imagine the 1990s. You look at a bookstore and you think, how can we automate the bookstore? Suppose Bezos had gone in there and he said, you know what? There's a cashier sitting there. Let's automate the cashier. We'll take the cashier out and we'll put a robot cashier and we'll have an automated bookstore. We can all see how lame that would have been. I mean, I guess they're still trying to work on that a little bit, automated cashier.
Ironically, isn't that what he's doing now with grocery stores?
A little bit. It turns out to be a lot harder and a lot less value than the main thing that Amazon did, which was just completely blow up the whole idea of a bookstore, use our browser instead. And so, you can piece by piece just take the existing process and automate bits of it. But ultimately, the bigger gain usually comes from reinventing the whole process. And then finally, policymakers. I spent a bunch of time testifying in Congress. I was at the White House a few times, and you look at the way we invest in education, the tax code. It's very skewed. The tax rates on capital are less than half of the tax rates on labor. So the government is really putting its thumb on the scale, saying, "Hey, if you solve the problem using capital, we're going to tax you a lot less than if you solve the problem using labor." And same in terms of investment tax credits. It's much more favorable for physical capital and software than it is for human capital. So in each case, we kind of are skewing towards replacing, automating rather than augmenting. And again, both of them can in many cases be beneficial, but I don't see a reason why we should be pushing so hard towards the automation when in many cases the bigger benefits are from the augmentation.
Yeah, and I think it's often overlooking a lot of the potential relatively easy high productivity gains. So I remember a long time ago, and you and I were sort of touching on this 20 years ago when I was running Dell's online business. One of the big surprises when we took all our computer sales online was the most successful sales weren't created online. They were created by customers doing research online and closing the transaction with a human. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that they tended to specify higher margin computers. And then the big savings for the company actually came downstream when they self-served on support, not on sales. So the nominal idea was let's eliminate salespeople. That quickly became replaced by let's make salespeople more productive. And we didn't want people necessarily buying online. We wanted them to call a sales rep, better informed. Yeah. And we had a lot of data that said those were the high profitability deals. If they close the transaction online, there's a tendency for them to underspec the computer.
Yeah. So. No, that makes a ton of sense. And again, there are times, by the way, I'm not like an absolutist about this. There are times when you do want to automate the process, but just in my experience working with managers, they tend to overemphasize it, and there's a lot of value left on the table by not thinking how we can augment instead of automate.
When you talk about the government, I wonder to what degree also do we have social pressures at some point. The Luddites throwing out spinning Jenny because they didn't want their jobs done away. I mean, we have a modern equivalent to that, right? The population would I think rightly be very concerned. There was some stat I saw that said that the biggest single employer of high school educated Americans was grocery checkout clerks. I'm not sure whether I got that stat right, but it sounds pretty feasible.
Yeah,
So
I think it depends on how you measure it. Truckers is also a big category, but depending on how you slice it, either of those are sort of the leaders.
Yeah, I mean, so you'd have autonomous trucks and self-checkout grocery stores, and we could potentially eliminate the most challenging segment of our population to create success out of. Hardly desirable.
Well, we've always been destroying jobs. We've always been creating jobs. There's this constant churn. And America, and no country has ever succeeded by trying to freeze in place the existing jobs or the existing industries. It's always been a churn. And when I look around, I see no shortage of work that humans can do better than machines. And I think it's going to be like that for decades to come. Now, there may be different sets of skills. I mean, one of the things that for now, I think humans have an advantage in some of the, we mentioned earlier, the emotional intelligence and connecting. And so it may be that as you combine, say, like you described it, your experience at Dell, maybe the machine does some of the configuration, but the human is kind of understanding better what the customer's needs are in a more nuanced way. So there will be a continuing kind of turnover as some jobs disappear and new jobs emerge. Now, I could imagine going decades into the future where we have a different issue where machines are better at that as well. But I don't think that's the challenge for the 2020s or even the 2030s.
Well, I mean, right now, the way, certainly our perspective, if we can get better data, better sort of decision support information in front of people who are asking to make choices in extreme ambiguity. In our universe, that's how do you manage a customer? And today, you literally have people guessing. It's entirely judgmental.
Right.
If we can give them data that essentially simply informs their choice and gives them a reason to have a different type of conversation or gives them pause for thought, the productivity increase associated with that could be quite profound. They could start making better judgments because guesswork is the worst of all possible. We don't call it guesswork often enough, but reality is it's guesswork, what most people are doing when it comes to these things. So the potential is certainly there. I did want to ask us perhaps a closing question here in terms of where you see the future going. Where are the areas for breakthrough that you're seeing on the horizon now?
Well, I've just been blown away by some of the things that are happening with these very large language models. So, I mean, the past decade, there's been a big set of breakthroughs around supervised learning systems, deep neural nets, and it's what I described earlier, mapping a set of X's into a set of Y's. And there's still so much low-hanging fruit on that. And that's really what most companies are focusing on right now, as they should be. But looking forward, these large language models like GPT-3 or their relatives, they're doing it for images like DALL-E, it's breathtaking. When I talk to my very smart AI colleagues, even they are surprised. They don't even fully understand why it's working so well. And when you come to like generating content, I'm working with Percy Lang, and we're doing a set of experiments to have these systems work with humans to generate ads, work with them to generate stories, work with them to generate social media posts, and they are really good. You look at them, I would say they're better than not the average college student, but probably like the 90th percentile college student in many cases. And that's pretty good. They're writing software, they're writing code. Microsoft has done some studies where when they introduce it, 30–40% of the code that the people have that are working with these tools end up being generated by these tools. In each case, there's always a human in the loop. These systems, they don't quite understand the truth very well. So they'll generate like content that's like sounds really, really good. And you have to check it because they just kind of string together words and they're really well written, but sometimes you have to be a little careful that it's kind of, not exactly right. But by keeping a human in a loop and kind of steering it and testing different ways, I see a huge enhancement in the ability of a lot of marketing, customer service, creative folks to do a much better jobs. I think it's a big frontier. Most of our work today in the United States and in advanced countries is information work, knowledge work. So this is going to be a huge boost to tens of millions of people.
Yeah, our head of editorial here, who manages a lot of our content, Morris, turned me on to DALL-E. I have to say, it's remarkable when you look at it. It's mind blowing how this works.
And it's only been a couple of years. It's getting so much better. I've seen some of the new ones that are doing some motion stuff, 3D. It's like, wow.
Yeah, but I think, as you said yourself, and perhaps a good note to close on, for a lot of businesses, the low-hanging fruit is application of what is now very mainstream approaches in machine learning to particular problems. And, there are going to be challenges around data wrangling, there's going to be challenges around organization. But this is the frontier for companies to get themselves organized. And really, there's no alternative. I mean, you said yourself, the winners are separate themselves from the pack. And if you don't get in front of it, you've really no choice.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, you don't have to go to the bleeding edge of what we just described to get value. I think that most of the value is just in these basic supervised learning systems, we call it standard machine learning. It's only like a decade old at most. And most companies have barely scratched the surface of what they can do that, or even data-driven decision-making, that earlier wave, which is, mostly worked its way through, but a lot of companies just from basic data-driven decision-making, that's where there's a huge amount of benefit. It's not going to automate anybody's job entirely, but people who use these tools are going to replace people who aren't using the tools. And so that's where the real transition is there's going to be a set of companies that have figured out how to use them. Right now, it's mainly the top 10%, and they are just crowding out the people who aren't using the tools.
Yeah, that's a great point to end on. Erik, thanks very much. Absolutely brilliant talking to you on this topic. Could talk for hours. It's fascinating. Congratulations on the move to Stanford. Sounds like it's a lot of fun for you. And I hope we get the chance to talk again soon.
Absolutely. It's always such a pleasure talking to you.